Hello YouTube, it's time for Styxhexenhammer's Christmas video. Of course, Christmas being subjective purely because it's based on pagan Yule, and we'll explain a little bit about that. And the title, of course, Jesus is not the reason for the season, is quite accurate because clearly those who have researched history and comparative religion, we understand that the time around December 22nd to 25th has been celebrated for a very long time. It wasn't first celebrated by Christians. The problem is this. It's an open secret that Christmas, and there are even some Protestants who understand this and actually don't even celebrate Christmas anymore. They understand that the Christmas holiday, as it is, was invented by the Catholics, and it was invented by the Catholics to give people, it was actually, there was a heresy at the time that was going on, in which people believed, a large number of the Christians, and of course they were all Catholics, believed that Jesus was not actually human. They didn't believe that he was truly physical, truly representative of a human. They felt that he was more of a deity who had come down in physical appearance, but who was not actually physical. That is, that he didn't suffer on the cross, he was never in any actual danger, that he was essentially a possessed vessel to redeem people. And this was a heresy that was going on in the Catholic Church at the time. They then took the pagan solstice celebrations, because they were already a large holiday, because at this time Catholic Christians and the pagans were coexisting, not peacefully, but they were forced to coexist due to the large numbers of both. And they took that holiday and they turned it into Christmas. The problem is they chose what even the most conservative historians would say is the wrong date. They clearly chose it because it was based on the solstice, with the celebrations that were already familiar to the pagans. It could have been definitely used as a way to convert the pagans by saying, yes, I got a kitty here, by saying, look, our holiday celebrates blah blah, it's the same as yours, just convert to Christianity. The fact being they were wrong, but the pagans back then were no smarter than the Christians were, because they were all living in the Iron Age. They still thought, in many cases, the world was flat and populated by dragons. So these people created the religions that people, for some reason, worship today. The figure of Jesus, also, is rather strange. Now, I can't vouch for the complete accuracy of what I'm about to say, but I've got it from a reliable source. That is, another atheist that I know who does study religion extensively. And so far I've checked out anything he said, and he's always been right, or basically right. So I'm just going to assume that it's right, pending further investigation. Actually, I've got to get my, Googling skills out to look this up. But apparently, around the time the Romans conquered Egypt, which was before the period of Christianity, the Romans conquered the Egyptians. Well, not the Egyptians. For some reason, they didn't care when the Greeks took them over either, but they never really put up much of a resistance for some bizarre reason. But anyway, the Romans came to Egypt. They took some of the Egyptian gods and incorporated them into their own pantheon. Now, the Romans were famous for this, something that a lot of people don't know. The Roman tradition and the Greek tradition before them, even with the Persians, which they had conquered and kept trying to invade them, the tradition among these polytheistic groups, when they encountered a new religion, or they conquered certainly a new religion, they would take figures, literally deities, statues, religious writings and stuff. They would start translating them into their own language. They would attempt to reconcile pagan gods they considered things outside of, Greek Hellenism and Roman, pseudo-Hellenism to be pagan. They would take the gods of other groups and incorporate it into their own religion. They would do this either by identifying an external god with one of their own, For instance, they would perhaps say that Ahura Mazda was Zeus. So they would start worshiping Ahura Mazda. It was a different name, slightly different characteristics, but they believed that that was just the pagans' way of saying, oh, well, we're worshiping Zeus, we just know him by a different name. They would chalk it up to language differences, which went on for centuries. The Greeks did the same thing. They started worshiping Horus from the Egyptian tradition, and apparently, around the time of the solstice, certain cults that sprang up, and of course when they used the term cult, they didn't necessarily mean it as anything negative. They would parade a statue of Horus around in a manger around the same time that the manger scene of December 25th is used. And Horus shares essentially the same characteristics of Jesus. The idea of resurrection, the idea of a virgin birth, somewhat androgynous birth in Horus's case. All of these things have so much similarity between Horus and Jesus that you can't help but wonder, was that also incorporated into this, Christmas time myth? The fact is that the solstice is the reason for the season. The reason for the season are the seasons themselves. That is, that this time period is celebrated not because Jesus was actually born on that date. Anyone who thinks Jesus was born in Christmas, all you have to do is read the Bible itself, note that the shepherds were in the fields tending their flocks. I'm sorry, but in mid-December, in Israel, the shepherds are not tending their flocks. They're not doing much of anything. They're getting drunk back at their homes because it's too cold to put the animals out. And yes, this is something other people don't know as well. Yes, Israel gets cold during the winters. Places like Turkey and even places like Tunisia and Libya, they get cold during the winters. They're not part of sub-Saharan Africa. They're north of that. They do have an actual winter. So anyway, Jesus obviously is not the reason for the season. Now, Christians will come out and they'll say that this is some sort of war on Christmas, war on their moral structure. It's not a war on Christmas. I personally don't care if Christians want to worship at the pagan altars every December 25th. Actually, I think it's kind of neat that they bow down before pagan idols once a year. Actually, twice a year when you count Easter, because, and as I'll make in an Easter video coming soon, that's a movable feast designed to be a fertility holiday, and it was all about sex. It has nothing to do with, whatever the hell Jesus supposedly did on Easter. He didn't do anything like that. Anyway, no, the solstice is the reason for the season. And as some astute... See, the problem is this. Only the most rabid fundamentalist Protestants don't celebrate Christmas and actually acknowledge that it's a pagan holiday. The problem being those individuals are so rabidly bigoted and insane that the other Christians get turned off from the idea and assume that Christmas is a Christian holiday. I would encourage all Christians, though, simply study your history. You can see, historically, accurately, scientifically, logically, whatever you want to call it, you can see that this date period was celebrated long before, Jesus was even a thought in contemporary culture. Long before the Iron Age, even back in the Bronze Age. People were still, driving around on chariots with bronze swords and leather armor. It was a primitive time, and people were still celebrating the solstice. You've got various, and the thing is, it's not even limited to the Roman region. There were places that the Romans never set foot that were celebrating the same thing long before Rome even existed. The Scandinavians were celebrating the solstice. The Celts were celebrating the solstice. The Druidic sort of people. There were groups in the East that celebrated the solstice period. All sorts of places celebrate the solstice period. Mainly, almost every culture had some sort of seasonal ritualism behind them. It wasn't limited to the Jews suddenly started worshiping Jesus and then a bunch of Gentiles joined in and they said, well, December 25th, Joe over there remembers Jesus. He says he was born on the 25th of December. And magically, he shares all of these characteristics with all these other pagan gods that happen to be solstice gods. He's similar to Horus, he's similar to Mithra, all of these other figures, and there are like half a dozen of them that Jesus just happens to be like. The fact is that the symbolism in the story is getting confused. The 12 disciples are just the 12 months. The 12 disciples represent the 12 months in the calendar. There's no other reason why there are 12 of them. There's no other reason why Horus had 12 disciples, or Mithra. These are figures that are seasonal. These are figures that are identified by the movements of the sun. These are sun gods. Jesus is the sun, as in bright yellow disk in the sky, of God. That's the real tradition behind Jesus Christ. It has nothing to do with saving people. In a way, you could say that the idea of being resurrected itself, and this is common to these solstice figures as well, these solar figures, the idea of being resurrected was not so much literally being a human, dying and rising from the grave. The idea, the symbology behind this, and Kitty is coming over for a petting again, the symbology is actually the sun declining to the solstice point in the winter, at which point the sun in some places in the earth doesn't even appear, and goes to its lowest point. Then it comes back. It's the revival of that solar period. Because people back then, I can just imagine there must have been terror in the streets the first few times they noticed that the sun was going away. When they started to develop rudimentary technology, they were probably like, Jesus, the world is just going to be pitch black. But then the sun came back, and they're like, oh, we're saved. Well, let's base our religion around it. We've got to figure out what we were doing that day that the sun came back. We've got to make that into rituals. And thus religion was born. Some of the earliest religions you can see have a solar bent to them because the sun happens to be where all the food comes from, makes the plants grow and stuff. Early man recognized this. He wasn't completely brain dead. So anyway, 12 disciples or 12 seasons. Resurrection is just the solstice ending and the sun starting to come back. Jesus is Horus and Mithra. The solstice is the reason for the season. There's no other purpose to it. There are too many different pagan gods that come before Jesus that share the same attributes to overlook them and say they're coincidental. It's symbology. That's all it is. It's likely, based on this fact alone, that there never was a Jesus. That Jesus is simply a way of the Romans pacifying the population by giving them someone to worship other than polytheism, because polytheism had hundreds of different cults, and the Romans realized that through one Catholic church they could control the population. They could control their behaviors. This is a Roman cult. Ironically, the people like Paul, who came after Jesus supposedly lived and died, hijacked the Christian religion and made it into Romanism. And the Paulites and the Romanites, which you might as well call the Catholics, still reign to this day. And even their offshoots, the Protestants and the Orthodoxy and stuff, they celebrate the same thing. They're still too dumb to understand their own symbology. They still don't understand that the figure that they worship and give their eternal love to is the sun. It's a semi-animate object in the sky that ejects hot plasma. That's all that they're worshiping. They have anthropomorphized this figure and turned it not into the sun S-U-N, but the sun S-O-N of God. But the fact is they're worshiping a star. And I'll go into Islam next Eid, or however the hell you pronounce that crazy pagan holiday. I'll go into why the Muslims are a lunar cult. And people will be amazed. People, they haven't even researched it. Go, literally, look up Horus and Jesus similarities sometime. You'll be amazed. It's funny. So, Merry Christmas to all the Christians out there, because you have the right to worship whatever altar you want to. Happy Yule to the pagans, or whatever other holiday you might celebrate this time of year. Me, I'm going to celebrate Chris Mahana Kwanzaa Yule, okay?